We all think of childhood as just a fact of life, right? A biological thing. But what if I told you it isn't? What if the whole idea of childhood actually had to be invented? Today, that's exactly what we're digging into, the surprising history and the modern science that completely shapes how we see kids. So, let's dive in.
Is a pretty wild thought, isn't it? We just assume childhood is this timeless, universal stage of life. But, and this is the crazy part, for most of human history, that's just not how people saw it. The entire concept that we take for granted had to be created. Okay, so this is where it gets really clear. The difference between then and now is just huge. Way back when, children were basically seen as miniature, not quite finished adults. They were tiny adult clothes, they were expected to work, and their lives were just a kind of warm-up for the real thing. Fast forward to today, and we see childhood as this incredibly important, protected, unique stage of life, crucial for learning and growing. So how in the world did we get from there to here?
To really get this shift, we've got to take a step back and look at a world where the idea of being a kid was totally, fundamentally different. Now, this is one of my favorite parts because it totally busts a common myth. For ages, people would look at these old paintings of kids in stuffy, grown-up outfits and think, wow, their parents just didn't care. But that's not it at all. Think of these portraits, especially for the rich and powerful, as being like a historical LinkedIn profile. It was all about showing off the child's future status, their potential, who they were going to marry. It was about ambition, not a lack of love. So if art was just reflecting the old way of thinking, what finally shook things up? Well, the real game changer didn't come from artists. It came from a couple of philosophers who completely turned Western thought about children on its head. First up, you've got John Locke. In the 17th century, he dropped this bombshell of an idea, tabula rasa, which means blank slate. He argued that kids aren't born good or bad, their minds are empty, and their character gets written entirely by their experiences. And this was a massive shift, right? Because all of a sudden, the pressure was on. Adults now had this huge responsibility to carefully shape and mold a child through education. Then, about a century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau comes along and says, hold on a minute. He had a totally different take. He pushed back on that blank slate idea. For Rousseau, children weren't neutral at all. They were born inherently good. He believed it was society that messed them up. So for him, the whole point of education wasn't to write on a blank slate, but to protect a child's natural goodness and let it grow. These two ideas really set the stage for a debate that, believe it or not, we're still having today. Okay, so we've got these big philosophical ideas swirling around. How did we get from there to the actual science we use today? Let's take a look at the modern way of seeing things. So today, developmental psychology breaks childhood down into these pretty distinct periods you see here. You've got infancy, then toddlerhood, moving into early childhood, and finally middle childhood. Each one of these stages has its own set of milestones and changes, almost like a roadmap for how we grow. But wait, it gets even more detailed. Inside each of those stages, we look at development across 4 different but totally connected areas: the physical, the cognitive, the social, and the emotional. And here's the key. You really can't pull them apart. A change in one affects all the others. This is what it means when educators talk about understanding the whole child. Now, even with all these fancy frameworks, don't think for a second that the science is all settled. Nope. There are still some huge debates that really shape the entire field. And here's the big one, the one you've probably heard of: nature versus nurture. Are we who we are because of our DNA or because of what happens to us? The nature camp says it's all in our genes, like a biological blueprint just unfolding. The nurture camp says no, it's all about our environment. But the modern view? Well, scientists now say they're, and I love this phrase, hopelessly interwoven. Our genes actually influence the kinds of environments we seek out, and our experiences can literally switch our genes on or off. It's a two-way street. Here's another really cool debate. Is our development a smooth, gradual process, or does it happen in big, distinct leaps? This slide has the perfect analogy. Is it more like a tree, which just steadily grows bigger and more complex, but is always, a tree? Or is it more like a butterfly, which goes through these completely different stages: egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, butterfly, where each one is fundamentally different from the last? Different theories land on different sides of this question. So with all this complexity and all these debates, how do scientists actually figure out what's going on with kids? How do they separate fact from fiction? Well, a lot of it boils down to understanding one really critical difference.
Let's play a little game. I'm going to ask you a question that sounds completely ridiculous at first. If you look at the numbers, you will find that on days when ice cream sales go way up, so do the number of drownings. So, does eating ice cream cause drowning? The answer is, of course not. This is a perfect textbook example of what we call correlation. The two things are definitely related. They happen at the same time, but one doesn't cause the other. There's a hidden third factor doing the real work: hot weather. When it's hot out, more people buy ice cream and more people go swimming. It's that simple. And that brings us to the other really important side of the coin: causation. This is when one thing is the direct result of another. Being able to tell the difference between correlation and causation is honestly one of the hardest but most important jobs for anyone who studies how kids develop. Okay, we've gone on quite a journey here, right? From history to philosophy to these big scientific debates. So why does any of this actually matter? What's the real-world takeaway from all this? It all kind of boils down to this one really important idea that educators live by: developmentally appropriate practice, or DAP for short. This is how all that theory gets put into action. It means making decisions for kids based on three things: what we know about child development in general, what we know about each specific kid as an individual, and finally, respecting their unique social and cultural world. And a huge part of that practice is understanding how kids actually learn best. We tend to think all stress is bad, but look at this. The science tells a totally different story. This is the stress performance curve. It shows that with too little stress, we get bored and we don't perform well. With way too much stress, we get overwhelmed and we burn out. But right there in the middle, that's the sweet spot. A little bit of healthy, manageable stress is actually where we're focused, engaged, and do our best work. It's essential for building resilience. Which brings us to our final thought for today. We've traveled from a time when children were seen as little adults all the way to understanding the intricate science of how they grow. And now, the really big question for all of us, for parents, for teachers, for our whole society, is how do we use what we know? In our effort to protect our kids, are we actually giving them the healthy challenges they need to build that resilience and truly thrive? That's definitely something to think about.